Welcome to the Syneos Health Podcast, Early Signals, where we explore the ideas, innovations, and emerging trends shaping the future of oncology. I'm Dr. Wael Harb, Head of R&D and Scientific Strategy in Oncology at Syneos Health. Recorded live from ASCO 2026, these conversations bring together perspective from leaders across biopharma, academia, and technology on the signals they're watching most closely, from AI-enabled drug development and real-world evidence to precision medicine. These conversations offer a snapshot of where oncology innovation is headed next. Let's tune into one of our conversations now. Today's guest is someone who has spent 3 decades inside the machinery of clinical research and decided that the machinery itself needs rebuilding. Kent Thoelke is the founder and CEO of Paradigm Health, a healthcare technology company that combines a global provider network with an AI-powered research platform to make clinical trials more accessible and efficient. He is a pioneering healthcare executive with over 30 years of clinical research experience. And before founding Paradigm, he served as the Chief Innovation Officer at ICON, following its acquisition of PRA Health Sciences, where he was the Chief Scientific Officer. What makes Kent essential listening right now is his conviction that the system is failing. The very patient is built to serve. He said plainly that patients who might be best served by a clinical trial often cannot get access, that research departments are chronically overburdened by trial complexity, and the human cost of inaction is unacceptable. Paradigm's answer is to bring trials to where patients actually are, using large language models to reduce the labor required for community and rural health system, to participate in oncology research and embed the capacity directly into physician workflows. And the moment is real. Just recently, Paradigm has launched a landmark research collaboration with FDA in April 2026 to accelerate clinical trial execution and regulatory review, capturing data directly from electronic health record and transmitting only the clinical signals needed for regulatory determinations in real time. Kent, it's a real pleasure to have you at the booth. Welcome to Early Signals.
Thank you, Wael. It's nice to be here.
Kent, walk us through your journey. You have one of the most interesting journey. What makes you come to Paradigm from where you started in clinical research?
I mean, the early days, I went to university and thought I'd be a scientist and started in bench science and got a job right out of college as a bench scientist and did that for a year or so and very quickly realized that bench science was not for me. I am too empathetic and too connected to humans, and being behind the scenes didn't really fit. I was working at the time for a multinational corporation, and they had an opportunity to join the clinical research division. It was a breast cancer trial at the time, and I thought, I'm going to try that. And that's really where the journey started. I think that was, the early 90s maybe. And all of a sudden, I was thrust into this world where we were seeing patients and connecting patients to therapies that were life-saving, life-changing. And it was a fulfillment that I really hadn't had in my career to date. So when you're on the lab, you do lots of things, but you never get to see the actual output. And so seeing patients enrolled in trials was really, really an amazing experience for me. And then I moved from very simple trials into super complex bone marrow transplant trials, which in the late 90s was really cutting edge therapy for anybody. We worked with one of the pioneers, Fred Hutch, Don Thomas. And at the time, there was really nothing for those patients. And so we really were a lifeline. And the clinical trials we were conducting, those patients really had no other way to potentially live longer. And so I was a clinical research associate at the time, a monitor. And back in those days, even though we had HIPAA and privacy, and I spent much of my time in the charts next to the patient in their room. And so you could see again, the direct impact of these drugs we were creating on patient lives and their families. At the time, we still had paper charts. I don't know if many people are aware, bone marrow transplant patients are in the hospital for 100 days, 120 days. It's a lot of paper charts. We're talking about stacks and stacks and stacks of charts, which we had to manually review. We collected data with pen and paper, and I moved through that journey. I got into clinical research, and clinical research at scale for me started kind of in the late 90s, and I have been evolving with it ever since. I think that that would sound amazing, except for really the last huge technological advancement that I remember in my career was when we went from three-part NCR clinical research forms into electronic data capture. And I think that that was in the early 2000s. And then we have just rested on our laurels. Everybody in the industry for 25 plus years now has really just accepted that the model we're in, which is moderately tech-based, is sufficient. And in the early 2000s, clinical research participation rates in the US were about 4 or 5%. And now, at the end of my career almost, they're still at 4 or 5%. From my early biotech work, I went into CROs. I lived in that model. We did the same thing. We just perpetuated that model, only at scale. So now instead of a couple of hundred people, we're talking about tens of thousands of people part of the process in a CRO, and globalizing a process that was inefficient and slow to start with. So now we just made the problem bigger and bigger and bigger, but we haven't seen any increased output. Towards the end of my CRO career as a chief scientific officer and chief innovation officer, I started really thinking about how can we accelerate or optimize the actual infrastructure for trials. And it started pre-COVID with decentralized trials. I thought that was a way to get more data and more patients involved. And then when I left the CRO industry, I thought I would retire. And I just had this opportunity from a venture capital firm to say, if we could start all over, and you could start this journey and create a whole new ecosystem for the clinical trial space, and you could do it with all the technology you had today, what would you build and how would you build it? And I thought that was an opportunity that was too great to pass up. That's how I ended up founding Paradigm, and that's how I got here today.
That's an inspiring story from benchtop scientist to CRA, and now you're leading one of the most exciting AI and clinical research companies at Paradigm Health. I would like to ask you about what you just mentioned of the poor enrollment rate. Less than 5% of patients get enrolled in clinical trials, and that have not changed in the last 20 years. We are implementing technology, but much slower pace than what has happened in the rest of the industries. Can you explain to us why this problem and what is the best way to tackle it?
I think it's really interesting that outside of healthcare, there are very few industries that have not adopted technology solutions at scale to optimize efficiency. This is even before AI. The financial industry, the banking industry is a good example. Nobody today, I think, would accept the idea that you couldn't do mobile banking on your phone, especially if you're a millennial. If you're younger than me, you likely wouldn't do that. And so this concept that people used to have to go into a bank and fill out a paper form to get money, and then you had to wait for somebody, like that just wouldn't be acceptable. And so as technology advanced, it became a fabric of people's lives. But somehow healthcare managed to stay completely separate. And it's a little bit of the mystique. Physicians owned that process. They owned that relationship. The FDA for many, many years reinforced that separation between healthcare and the rest of how the world worked. Although it is interesting to me that while the FDA is a highly regulated world, healthcare, drug development, highly regulated, I would argue that the financial industry is also highly regulated and managed to adopt all of these things. It has been frustrating for me to try to get both of those cognitive processes to match. So the people that work at the hospitals and run clinical trials, they also go home every day and rely on their iPhones and their laptops and their technology to make their life completely more efficient. And then we send them into the hospital to manually enter data in an electric data capture form that they would never do in their home life. And everybody says that's fine. And so I just got tired of saying that's okay, because really who loses in that model are the patients. So we have this massive ecosystem. Everybody goes to work. Everybody gets paid. Nobody has to worry about doing things better, different. But at the end of the day, the patients are the ones that are impacted. That just seems unacceptable for me anymore, especially in the world today.
How is Paradigm Health is trying to fix this problem?
We were fortunate that I launched the company about 4.5 years ago. Machine learning, natural language processing was really coming about at that time. The idea was, if the opportunity for a patient to become a participant in a clinical trial was dependent upon a physician or a study coordinator having the time to manually review a chart in the EHR, and then, if they were lucky enough to manage to get through all of their longitudinal records and they matched all the criteria and they managed to be presented to the trial, there's too many ifs in that model. If this happens, if that happens, what was happening was not enough patients were being screened or matched into trials. What we thought is if we could go to the source, the electronic health record, if we could use technology to replace all that manual chart review to find those patients, then we could at least scale the top of the funnel. We could start there. So if at least we screened more patients for inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria for participating in trials, at scale, we should be able to serve up more patients potentially eligible. And so we did that. We started integrating with electronic health records. You should think of Paradigm Health not as really a technology company or a CRO. We really are an extension of the healthcare systems that we serve. Our technology is embedded within the electronic health record. We work under business associate agreements, so we work under the same privacy constraints that the institution or the healthcare system does. Because of that, it gives us access to all the patient's personal healthcare information that is unblinded. That allows us the ability to do what we do, which is really in detail to match a patient and everything that's happened to that patient into a clinical trial by the exclusion criteria and inclusion criteria. And that model, although we started 4 years ago, was good at the time. Natural language processing, the idea that we could use technology to read medical records, at the time, it was just good. So I would say it was about 40% accurate. Even though people live in this world, 40% for a physician or a study coordinator means that 60% of the time the model was wrong, which just led to a lot of frustration and really poor user experience. Then 2 years ago, large language models really came about. And so the adoption of large language models, OpenAI, MedGemini, Claude, those machine learning tools now could read all of the structured and unstructured data in a chart, and we get to about 98% efficiency. So we almost doubled the ability to accurately match patients to trials for physicians today in a clinical trial or in a healthcare system.
So you're not only matching patient to clinical trial using AI and large language model, but you're also helping navigate the patient to the trial.
Yeah, so today, it's not really chance, but it really is point in time. So if a clinical trial site opens a study for a pharma company or a CRO opens it for a pharma company, once that trial is open, most of the physicians are made aware of the study design, the inclusion, exclusion criteria, but you're really relying upon the physician or study coordinator to notice the day that patient comes in the clinic that they could be eligible. And then they have to do all that background to understand if the criteria are met. And then they've got to have the conversation to consent the patient. For many of these patients, the timeline between finding that information out and getting therapy can be a week or 2 weeks. It's a very compressed timeline. And so for us, because we can see all of the patient records longitudinally in real time, because we have all the scheduling data, and because we are a support of the trial, we can look at a patient's journey months ahead of when they will become eligible for a trial. So we deploy the inclusion exclusion criteria algorithms and the large language models to understand where does a patient sit in their journey. So as an example, if you had a second line metastatic breast cancer study, we can follow all the patients on first-line therapy through their journey. And then as they become closer to eligibility, and we know that, as an example, they'll be coming in for a scan, we can preempt all those conversations with the physician to say, this patient is coming in 2 weeks. They've met all the criteria except progression. When they have their scan, if they progress, they will be eligible. And here's all the criteria to make them eligible. It just takes all the unknowns out of the process. We shouldn't miss any patients in this model. We should at least be able to present every patient to the physician, and then they can make a medical judgment if the patient actually is qualified for the trial.
That's fascinating. Can you quantify the impact of deploying your what you call augmentation or site extension for the research programs? How has that really impacted the enrollment rate, or even like we talked about the low enrollment rate as a system, and the percent of patients who are going into the clinical trial and enrollment rate for that study? Has that really affected enrollment rate positively in a meaningful way?
Everybody in the clinical trials space that works within pharma or the CRO world, they start with their skeptical hat. Everything is show me. And part of that is the fact that for 25 years, we haven't made any impact. We've tried multiple solutions. Nothing has really worked. I would argue that the technology is different today by many, many scales. We have multiple case studies. When we deployed the company originally into community and rural hospitals. That was on purpose. So 85+% of the patients in this country that get cancer care get it in a community or rural setting, not in an academic or tertiary medical setting. But the reality is 85 or 90% of the trials are run in academic and medical centers or tertiary cancer centers. And so we go into the community, and that's really where we've seen significant impact. We have a case study with a healthcare system in North Dakota, rural North Dakota, where we increased the participation rate in trials from 4% to 11% in a year. Those don't seem like huge numbers, but when you look at the absolute numbers for patients, you think about that 7 or 8% of patients that got offered a trial that would otherwise not have had a trial. That is a significant increase for those patients. We have another healthcare system in Northwest Arkansas, another rural system. We increased participation by 145% through screening in 12 months. It's not surprising because if you think about the model I explained earlier, we don't miss any patient. So we should see those numbers. If anything, I want to see numbers that are in the 20-30% range. And so we just launched with one of the largest community healthcare systems in the country, Sanford Health. Their target for next year is to have 20% of their patients in clinical trials. And they're doing that with our technology. And if you look at how the model works, we launched last week. The first 5 days of the trial, we identified 2 patients and they were consented and put on study. And that's how it should work. We should know where every patient sits. The day a trial opens, we should have patients ready. We shouldn't have this model, and I know you live through this all the time, where we open a site and then we wait 3 months for first patient in. That model should go away.
Can you give us an idea about your network? I understand recently Paradigm Health acquired Flatiron Research Network. Are these mainly community? Is there academic centers? How many sites, how many patients you're touching with your network?
So we started in hematology oncology. And when we launched the company, we acquired a smaller company that was in clinical trial matching called Deep Lens. They had about 25 community sites, mostly small, independent oncology practices. And we always knew that was interesting, but we needed scale. The only way this works is with scale. Anytime we talk to pharma companies or CROs, they're like, well, that's nice, but we need to deploy as many sites as possible across the US. We can't just have 1 or 2. And so we very thoughtfully started to grow the network one by one. We went out to large community healthcare centers. We deployed our platform. We created the value proposition for them. And then towards the end of last year, as you mentioned, we acquired the clinical research side of Flatiron Health, which gave us significant scale. Flatiron had been in the business for over a decade. They had cultivated and created a very large network with their own EMR. We took over that clinical research side of the business. Combined networks today represent about 165 healthcare systems across the U.S. Those big systems have multiple sites. So we have centers like Florida Cancer Specialists. That is a healthcare system, but there are 40 plus sites in that network. When you translate that, it looks about 2,200 sites across the U.S. today. We also knew that the U.S. alone was not going to answer the question because then it's always one more question. Pharma's like, where else are you in the world? So we partnered with Fujitsu a number of years ago in Japan. Fujitsu owns the electronic health record that's primarily used in Japan. It's about 80% of the market. They deploy our software in Japan. And then we did a partnership with the National Cancer Center East and National Cancer Center in Japan. Today, we deploy through there to do clinical trial matching and eSource. And then subsequently, we partnered with Sheba Medical Center in Israel. Sheba wanted an enterprise solution for how they did all of their work to make it more efficient. So today we operate in 3 countries, the US, Japan, and Israel. We have 25 academic medical centers in the network as well. They're different than community centers because the way they focus, the way they're built, their infrastructure. Those systems in our models today are primarily deploying our eSource, not the matching.
You mentioned eSource. Can you explain more to the average audience? What is that, and how is that helpful for clinical trials?
The electronic data capture part of our business is still a significant bottleneck. So the big players in that space, the Medidatas of the world, the Vivas of the world, for most of us in this career, that has been since the early 2000s all we know, which is we create electronic case report forms. When patients are entered into a trial, there are research staff, data staff at the site. They take the data from the medical record, the EHR, and then they manually enter it into the electronic data capture forms that sit in a separate system. From a user experience, it's not a very good process. So there's multiple logins. You've got to wait to enter the data. It's complex. It auto-generates queries if the data is not entered correctly. But most of that is manual transcription. When you manually transcribe things, one, the pharma company and the CROs are dependent upon the site staff having the time to enter that data. So we end up with a tremendous amount of data backlog. Once the data is entered, then we need a CRA to go out and monitor the data because it's been manually entered. So we have to worry about transcription errors. You need time to get on site. Most of these big centers limit how many CRAs can come on site and when they can come on site. So there's all of this time loss in that model. Because we're embedded into the electronic health record, you can imagine we already see all of that data. So now we basically map all of our data from the EHR, the medical record, into the fields that are in the electronic data capture form. And we are agnostic to the EDC system. And we can transcribe about 90% of the data. There are many systems out there today that started with structured data. So if you think about things like lab values, numbers, anything that's numerical that is just a structured field, those transfer very fast. They're very easy to do. It's about 30% of the data. The challenge has always been in oncology because much of the data comes from unstructured fields, physician orders, physician notes, H&Ps, images, pathology, all of those things. So now that we have LLMs, the LLM can read that information and then structure it and then move it into the EDC system. That's really the EHR to EDC. People say eSource all the time. eSource is really when we create direct data capture forms in that environment because not all the data for a trial lives in the EHR. And so we still do create in our environment direct data capture forms, which become the actual source. But if you think about that entire model, because of our placement in the EHR, we always have access to the source for queries, for monitoring, for digital audit trails. Everything is captured in that model.
So you're taking away the manual labor from the clinical research staff so they can focus on what's really matter for the patient.
Absolutely.
And expedite the process of moving this data so it can be used in drug development.
Yeah, and I think, you hear a lot about AI in the world, and I think there's this huge fear that's created. Remember, we work in community and rural systems, but you can imagine a really big healthcare system like an MD Anderson, a Cornell. I mean, they have 100 data managers whose job it is to enter that manual data into those case report forms. And so when they hear about AI, they get concerned that their job will go away. And I would argue that this is really AI for good because it is true that we will need less people to manually enter data. But these healthcare systems then should be able to deploy 5x or 10x the trials, which is great for patients because they get more access to trials. Pharma gets more shots on goal. And for the healthcare systems, those people get to be retrained into jobs where you're providing patient care or trial care as opposed to just data entry. And so for a lot of the community healthcare systems we work with, that labor arbitrage, that ability to take away the need for the manual labor, allows them to participate in research at scale the same way academic centers do without having to hire all the headcount.
That's great. Lately, Paradigm Health and you personally been a lot in the news with the new announcement from the FDA for the real-time clinical trials. We got a lot of questions at ASCO from different companies, really curious to learn about it and how they can participate. Can you walk us about what's real-time clinical trials and the FDA initiative?
Again, to the non-healthcare industry, if you go out anywhere else, this rapid adoption of large language models is evolving so quickly, much of the world can barely keep up. So the foundational models keep changing. The ability for large language models to learn on their own, to be used at scale, has just been proceeding at a rapid pace. What's interesting is the FDA, as an institution, has not traditionally been known for being particularly innovative and speedy. So what's interesting is sponsor companies move at the speed of the regulators. And the speed of the regulators has quite honestly been very slow over the last couple of decades. And so all of a sudden, in maybe December of last year, the FDA had brought in a new commissioner, Marty McCary, and a chief AI officer, Jeremy Walsh. And they started to ask those questions the same way we're asking questions on the clinical trial side is, could we not be using technology to make quicker, faster decisions? And when you look at the amount of data that's coming in for a general application to the FDA, you're talking about anywhere from 40, 50, 60 million pages of documents that are being sent to the FDA that somebody has to look at, codify, file, and then review. And the reality is much of that data is not looked at. And so the question they asked was, if we looked at a clinical trial protocol and we look at the primary endpoints that the reviewers need to see to determine safety and efficacy, is there a world or a model where instead of sending all that data, we could just predetermine what are those signals? What is a safety signal? What is an efficacy signal? And if we could do that, could we just send the signals to the reviewers and they could make much quicker decisions in real time? But to do that, they needed a technology company that had access to the electronic health record, because the only way to get that real-time data, and if we go back to that conversation about data backlog, if you're waiting for somebody to enter data at a site, you're completely at the mercy of them. So real time doesn't really happen. In this model, because we're integrated into the EHR, we can see all of those things that happen in real time. And so we met with the FDA. They had been talking to a couple of other very large technology vendors, as you can imagine. But our business at Paradigm is really around clinical trials and how do we use our technology to optimize trials. The really big technology companies, they're not in the clinical trials space. And so similar to you, if you haven't lived the world that we live in and you look at it from the outside, it's very hard for you to figure out how to solve for it. And so we met with the FDA. We signed a collaborative research agreement very quickly. And then we started working with the FDA and 2 pharma companies, Amgen and AstraZeneca, in January of this year. And then we collaborated with the OCE office at FDA, the leadership, and the review division to take clinical trial protocols, these 2 proof of concept clinical trial protocols. And we worked with the agency to identify all of the endpoints and key data elements. And then because we sit in the EHR, we then mapped all of those elements to where would we find that data in the electronic health record. And so if you think about it this way, we basically configure a protocol for a pharma sponsor in the EHR. So the EHR knows all of the schedule of events that will happen to a patient. And then we predefine what the endpoints are. What qualifies as a grade 3 treatment adverse event? What qualifies as a dosing error? What qualifies as a response? And then the large language models and the technology and the algorithms, depending on the model, as a patient comes in and has a patient visit for a trial, and those things get entered in the EHR, immediately, if it's hit a signal, we create that signal. And in these models, in the proof of concept, those signals go to the sponsor company first, and then they go to the agency. It was a tremendously innovative and revolutionary concept for the agency, and we have been a part of it for 6 months now. We have developed all of the data pipes to the agency and the sponsors. We have developed all of the clinical trial reporting schema for the agency. And today, these proof of concepts are iterative. We will continue to learn with these 2 proof of concepts for the next probably 6 or 9 months. The other thing is, I think that FDA does lots of things on the policy side that you don't ever see the implications of the decision. In this model, the FDA said, we would like to make sure we are live before we announce this. So the AstraZeneca program went live before we announced publicly with the FDA. So this isn't a theoretical idea. It's not as though the FDA said, we'd really like to do this at some point. We are actually doing it. There are hundreds of signals today being sent from the AstraZeneca protocol to the agency and to AstraZeneca. It is full force, and we're excited to see where the agency goes with this.
It's very interesting that FDA is becoming an innovator in an environment that's been very slow to adapt innovation. Some of the skeptics about the regulators in general, they will say, well, how real this is? Is this just for news, but press releases? Is this really changing the FDA moving forward? And then there's a lot of questions about, do I want the FDA to see my safety data? What if inadvertently they hit the red button and say clinical hold? Ultimately, what is the benefit for a biotech company or pharma to participate in this program?
Those are all absolutely good questions to ask. I think on the is it real, I think that the fact that we launched the proof of concepts and they're happening is definitely validation that they intend to move forward. Our understanding from the agency, there's lots of changes in the agency right now at the leadership level, but everything that they have told us all the way up to the White House is that there is continued support, not only for real-time clinical trials, but for the modifications the agency has made to the IND process to make it quicker, the modifications they have made internally to deploy AI to the ability of reviewers to review prior submissions and data. There's multiple pillars to this approach. I think that why I'm not concerned that it won't continue to move forward is that much of this is being driven by a desire on the part of the federal government and the current administration to make R&D and early development research more accessible to the U.S. So, in the last probably decade, we have seen U.S. early development move from about 60% of the trial sites in the U.S. and then 40% outside to the reverse, where now we have 30 or 40% of early development work being done in the U.S. Much of it is being done in China, Australia, New Zealand, where those agencies have already updated their process to make it faster. And quite honestly, New Zealand, Australia, China, it's not as though they deployed phenomenal amounts of technology. They just started as bodies later than we did. And so they got to learn from where we sat, and they created much more efficient processes to get studies up and running quicker, to be able to review early phase data quicker, to make decisions, go, no-go decisions, dose escalation decisions, dose expansion decisions, phase 1 to phase 2 decisions. And so the government believes to make the U.S. more attractive for global pharma to bring those trials back, we have to create a regulatory environment that sustains that. The technology piece is one of those. So they won't happen without each other. We can't regulate or make policies to get us out of this. We've got to hold everybody's feet to the fire on how you make it happen. The realistic piece is the data piece, which is what we provide. So we're that infrastructure layer, and I think that it's already happening. So I think that all of those people involved see that this isn't something that could happen. It's already happening. Why there's value to biotech companies or pharma companies, the original intent of the agency was we have to make faster decisions in real time. I think that real-time clinical trials is probably not the right nomenclature. So it puts in people's heads that something's going to happen at the site and we're sending it immediately to the FDA and they might make a decision. I think it's better to think of it as like parallel review, so that as these signals happen on a trial, the reviewers are seeing them in relative real time. So by the end of the study, a reviewer will have seen all of the signals. To your point, will they see one safety signal and hit the red button and put it on hold? What the agency has told us in this iterative process, while they see the signals and they learn from them, is they don't intend to make regulatory decisions off a single point in time, single signal. Now, to be fair, if I was a sponsor company and I saw no signals in the first half of my trial, I would argue that's a really good thing. So if you're looking to make decisions quickly on go, no-go, or dose escalations or early development decisions, you also as a sponsor company get to see that data in real time as well. The value driver ultimately will be speed and compression. Also, again, at the end of the study, instead of waiting for all those cycles for the data to be entered, cleaned, sent, reviewed, all of that is months and months and months of process. Now the agency will have seen everything. In the proof of concept, we're doing EDC in parallel, so we can compare what do signals look like to the traditional EDC model. So the way this worked is the FDA announced an RFI to ask the industry, if we're going to use AI and we're going to do real-time trials, what are your concerns? What do you think about it? So the same questions you asked, there were 1,400 people on the industry day with FDA. They're asking all those same questions. Similar to you, I've met with 25 pharma companies at this meeting at ASCO. Everybody asked the same question. And so everybody's nervous about it, but also I think equally excited about the value. The reason the pilots are going to be in place is so that we can collaborate with the FDA to say, okay, this is what we like and don't like about this model. This is how fast we want signals to go to the sponsor first and then to the reviewers. So I think that collaboration will help get through all of those questions.
So to focus on two important questions from a sponsor perspective, should they worry about the signal misinterpreted and the study get held because of toxicity? Maybe it's not related to the drug.
There's two pieces to that. The reason we spend so much time upfront with the sponsor company, and in this case, OCE and the agency, is to really think through what are all the potential signals for that endpoint, and then what are all the potential data points that could cloud that signal. So we think through all of those things. For the pilot studies, it will be iterative as well. So when those signals come in, they will come to the sponsor first on the safety side. The sponsor will have a chance to review that signal, same way it happens today. So in the pilot studies, we also will have EDC. So the traditional model will be happening. What we've been told is that for safety processes, we will still maintain the standard regulatory environment for safety reporting, and then we'll match those to the signals. So every engagement we've had with the agency has said that that won't be an issue. And it's also why both Amgen and AstraZeneca asked to see the safety signals first. You can't hold on them. I mean, the goal is not to let the sponsor company change them. But what we have talked to the agency about is, as with any adverse event signal, if it changes over time, then we will send new signals to the reviewers, which is why they won't make decisions probably in single point, single time.
My understanding, the FDA is interested in the next pilot, which I think is about 9 to 11 trials. It need to be in early phase oncology trials and should be in flight, ready to start. A lot of these studies could be in small biotech companies. So what would be the benefit? Why a small biotech company should consider participating?
The challenge probably for small biotechs is there will be costs associated with this because you're essentially doing the signal side that we do, and you're doing traditional EDC models. But for small biotech companies in early development, so remember, these are open label studies. They're not randomized or blinded. The sponsor company will also get to see in real time what those signals look like. Instead of the current model, this legacy manual model where people are waiting for a site to manually enter data, and then you've got a CRA go out and look at it, or they're sending the data in. You're talking about weeks of time, maybe a month or two of time. That compression of timeline for a small biotech is super valuable. So if you can be seeing signals early on, and again, the challenge always is if the study's really, really big, you want to avoid a type 1 error decision. But if you're talking about 3 to 6 patients in a cohort and you want to see very quickly if you've got any signals or toxicities that would inhibit dose escalation or dose expansion, they will see all of that in real time as well. So there's already timeline compression just in the model. We're trying to convince sponsors to also use the EHR to EDC part of our platform, again, to minimize the data entry, to get the data in faster. Again, when we send it to the sponsor and agency at the end, you're not waiting for all of that manual piece. So we think there's value in that for biotechs as well.
Would there be any potential benefit of there's really significant efficacy signal where the FDA might expedite the process of moving to the next stage of the trial?
That's really, really interesting. I was talking to Sean Cozen last night about his time at the agency, and there have been a number of cases. And we just saw it in this last couple of weeks with pancreatic cancer, where in the randomized trials, the curves are so separate that the agency has made some quick decisions. I think in this model, it's not unreasonable to think that by the end of a study, again, these are early phase, so it's unlikely they'll probably make a big regulatory decision, but you could see early response data that is so significant that somebody would expand a cohort or add a cohort, or if it was a bucket trial, maybe expand tumor types, given positive signals from the response criteria. The other thing to think about is for many of the oncology trials, response criteria does not live in the EHR. Resist is not a thing that actual oncologists use to take care of their patients in the real world. No physician is making his decision on treatment on resist criteria, but the agency and everybody so far is still using that. So we build those forms in the workflow for us. So where we can, we pull data from the pathology or imaging or whatever is appropriate, and then we fill those fields in, and then somebody still has to come in and manually enter that data for resist. But then we take that form that we have created in the EHR workflow, and then we create the signals from that. So for biotech companies, they could get signals very early.
Kent, you've always been visionary when it comes to clinical research and drug development. What do you see happening in the next 5 years?
I have talked to some unbelievably brilliant people at this meeting that blow your mind when they tell you what they're doing with artificial intelligence. I think there's a couple of things. One, I think that AI deployed across EHR data will help us from a discovery perspective. We have access to all of the NGS data. As people create new drugs, and this is not our business today, but you can imagine a world where people have access to that data, you can start to very quickly understand the connection between genotype data and phenotype data. I think companies, in the same way they're looking at creating synthetic twins, will start to look at the EHR and real world data and start to forecast out how patients will respond to a particular agent based off of everything we know about that patient. The challenge we have today is the longitudinal data of a patient is not really accessible to anybody. And so it's all point in time. And then we run these trials and we do all these analysis, but AI can do all of that. So if AI had the opportunity to look at a patient's entire longitudinal data, inclusive of all their genetic data, their genomic data, their phenotype data, and then their mechanism of action, and then the wealth of data that's out there on how other previous mechanisms have performed in similar populations, all of that modeling will become common practice. So the question will become how many actual patients we put on studies to run these trials in the future, and how much of it will be forecast through AI and what we can use AI on based on patient records. The other thing that has nothing to do with this, but is just visionary, and I think it's amazing, is GLPs have really changed how we think about body systems and medicine as well. And as we think about trials, and we're talking about oncology as the early part for the real-time clinical trials, but we're also talking to the agency about cardiovascular and neurology. When you think about a GLP pathway, and it looks like even from ASCO here, some of the data presented, although early, on the impact on oncology patients on survival with GLPs is interesting. I don't know why it's happening. I think we'll have to see it if it stays significant. But the impact on renal disease, the impact on cognitive impairment, the impact on substance abuse and that compulsive behavior, we're seeing these pathways that are covering multiple organ systems. So in the same way oncology was visionary in the early days to create bucket trials, I have to wonder if we won't get to a point where we start to do clinical trials that are pathway-based and not disease or organ system-based. And then if you think about like what you do and what I do, I mean, just think about the complexity of designing those trials for pharma clients and how we run those trials. And everything we do today is set up by organ system and disease state. And so I'm super intrigued by how this will all play out and the impact of those types of drugs. It's that horrible choice of living today and living the business you're breathing and then thinking 5 steps ahead all the time on what will this industry look like in 2 or 3 years.
Ken, thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. And that's very fitting to our theme of AI in oncology and how this transforming clinical trial. It was a pleasure having you.
Well, Wael, I share the honor with you. I think you share this passion and vision for working outside the status quo. And I think it's very hard for service-based models to step out of an industry that has been doing the same thing for 30 plus years. It's certainly scary for any big company. I think for CROs in particular, the challenge is real. CROs as an industry are a labor-based, margin-based model. The vision to say, okay, and especially for you, for AI in oncology, all right, well, what does that mean? If AI in oncology and how we treat patients and how we engage with patients and regulators is going to change, then how do we change our model? It's been a pleasure to work with you and to think, what does that mean for the actual nuts and bolts of how we run trials? I think it takes partners like that in the industry and physicians like yourself to really think through what is that going to look like.
Great. Thank you so much.
That's all for today's episode of the Syneos Health podcast, Early Signals. I'm your host, Dr. Wael Harb. If you have other topics you would like to hear on this podcast, please send us a message at podcast@syneoshealth.com. For access to more future-focused, actionable life science insights, please visit the Insights Hub at syneoshealth.com.